Welcome back. And now for the news in detail. In Syria, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces and the government have agreed to join forces to resist Turkey's ongoing military operation. Ankara plans to establish a border security zone in northern Syria. In separate statements, Damascus and the SDF said they reached an agreement during urgent talks in the Syrian capital over the weekend. Syrian state media reported government forces have begun to move northwards towards the provinces of Hasaka and Raqqa. The announcement came as the US ordered almost all the ground forces to pull out from the war-torn country. In an interview, Defense Secretary Mark Esper said the US was withdrawing its troops to avoid getting caught up in the fast escalating clashes. Turkey has captured several key border towns since launching its military operation last week. Turkey has urged NATO allies to support Operation Peace Spring in northern Syria. In a statement, President Erdogan said the international media is spreading misinformation about its efforts to establish a safe zone. Erdogan has departed to Baku, where he will attend the 7th summit of the Turkey Council this week. He said Ankara will comprehensively brief the summit's participants on the operation. Meanwhile, the National Defense Ministry says 525 terrorists have been neutralized since the operation began. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says Turkey's security concerns are legitimate. Speaking at a conference in London, Stoltenberg said, as no other ally has suffered more terrorist attacks than Turkey. He also said the military alliance should not lose its unity in the fight against the ISIS. Earlier, Turkey urged NATO allies to support its Operation Peace Spring in northern Syria. In a statement, President Erdogan said the international media is spreading misinformation about the campaign to establish a safe zone. Meanwhile, the National Defense Ministry says 525 terrorists have been neutralized during the operation. For more on this developing story, we are joined by Istanbul-based political analyst Can Hussasu, who is currently in the Turkish border town of Sunli Urfa. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Hussasu. The situation in northern Syria is growing increasingly complicated. Is Turkey in danger of being pulled into a full-fledged war with the Syrian government?
Well, actually, Syria doesn't have the power to move all these distances and come to Manbij or Kobani, and it doesn't have the numbers actually to fight Turkey or the ability. I mean, Syrian regime together with Iran and Russia, they did use some tactics to avoid Turkish movement. The YPG declared that they agreed with the Syrian regime to hand over these areas to the regime, but in fact, Manbij and Kobani, there are two different areas with different characters. Manbij is mostly Arab populated, and these people, instead of the regime, they were kind of agreed to be under the YPG control. But if the YPG guy says we're handing over this area to the regime, the Arab locals are not happy, and they are afraid of these kind of statements. And I don't think that they will act with the YPG command in this frame. Kobani is another story, is strategically further deep, and it's very far from the regime's reach. So far, I don't think that these kind of news is threatening the Turkish authorities. In fact, everyone knows that the Syrian government really doesn't have the power to confront Turkey.
Mr. Chan, Russia is a major player in Syria. Can President Erdogan's personal rapport with Vladimir Putin help avert the fighting between Turkish and Syrian government forces?
Actually, but we don't know about, because we have the United States in this story, in this operation as well. In the previous operations, it was an agreement between Russia and Turkey, and Russia was convincing Iran not to stop Turkey or stand in its way, and they worked on an agreed area for the operations. But in this one, I think day by day, the range of the operation changes according to the statements that comes. Communication between Ankara and Moscow will be very important within the upcoming days, but I can't really speculate about it.
Thank you, Mr. Hassasu. We were talking to Istanbul-based political analyst Can Hassasu. Now moving on, Russia's President Vladimir Putin begins his visit to Saudi Arabia by meeting with King Salman bin Abdul Aziz Al Saud in Riyadh. He was presented the Guard of Honor upon his arrival at the Royal Palace. Putin will also hold a meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman during his one-day visit. He is expected to discuss the Gulf situation as well as Syria and Yemen wars. Earlier in an interview, he praised the kingdom for its help to formulate a political settlement in Syria. Putin said he and Saudi leaders would talk about measures to avert any political fallout on international oil markets. He condemned the September 14 airstrikes on Saudi oil facilities. Saudi Energy Minister Prince Abdul Aziz bin Salman says the oil market is still volatile. Last month's drone attacks on Saudi oil facilities had cut about half of the country's oil capacity. The energy minister said the kingdom's oil production is expected at 9.86 million barrels per day in both October and November, while current exports stand at around 7 million barrels. The minister added that Riyadh is continuing its voluntary cuts at 400,000 barrels per day. In the United Kingdom, the Queen Elizabeth says the government's priority is to leave the European Union on 31st of October. In a speech to the Parliament, the Queen said the government seeks new partnership with the EU based on free trade and cooperation. She said Britain will continue to play a leading role in global affairs after leaving the bloc. The Queen's speech has formally opened the new parliamentary session.
My government's priority has always been to secure the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union on the 31st of October. My government intends to work towards a new partnership with the European Union based on free trade and friendly cooperation.
Now moving on, over 200 university students in Indian Telangana state have held a candlelight march against the lockdown in occupied Kashmir. Over 70 members of the Jammu and Kashmir Students Association also took part in the demonstration. Talking to reporters, the students said despite Indian media's claims, there is no normalcy in the occupied valley. Meanwhile, families of thousands of arrested Kashmiris are facing immense difficulties to meet them. Family members wade through endless checkpoints in Srinagar, where they have to wait for several hours. The occupying forces have arrested over 13,000 Kashmiris, mostly youths, since August the 5th. The New Delhi imposed clampdown and communications blackout has entered its 71st consecutive day. The UN says only biometric votes cast in the September 28 presidential elections should be counted. In a statement, the body endorsed the prior demands of the Afghanistan's Election Commission and Electoral Complaints Organization. The UN's assistance mission in Afghanistan urged the government and the electoral bodies to safeguard and complete the election process. UNAMA said the Afghans braved security threats to cast ballots last month and commended voters for carrying out their civic duty. The preliminary results of the presidential polls are scheduled to be announced on 19th of October. Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli says Nepal will never allow its territory to be used for separatist activities in China. Meeting China's President Xi Jinping in Kathmandu, Oli says Nepal firmly supports the One China policy. President Xi Jinping says any attempt to split China will end in vain. Both countries signed at least 15 agreements, including a deal to expand a railway link between the Himalayan nation and Tibet. The link will be part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which Nepal joined in 2017. Nepal sees the rail link with China as an alternative to its dependence on India. More stories to follow right after a short break. Stay tuned with Indus News. Welcome back. In a new wave of protests in Hong Kong, demonstrators have attacked police stations and vandalized businesses with ties to mainland China. Police said the protesters blocked roads and firebombed branches of the Bank of China, as well as the offices of pro-Beijing politicians. The protests marked the 19th week of protests. Officials said the protesters hurled over 20 petrol bombs at Mong Kok police station. Meanwhile, President Xi Jinping said any attempt to split China is doomed to fail. During his visit to Nepal yesterday, Xi Jinping said external forces' plan to split China are delusional. Moving on to Ecuador, where President Lenin Moreno and indigenous leaders have reached a deal to cancel a controversial austerity package. This ends nearly 2 weeks of violent protests. Under their agreement, Ecuador's government will pull out of an IMF package that included a sharp rise in the prices of petrol and diesel fuel. Indigenous leaders, in turn, will call on their followers to end days of protests and street blockades. The two sides said they will develop a new package of measures to cut government spending and reduce Ecuador's budget deficit. People across Ecuador came out on the streets to celebrate the unexpected deal. In Algeria, hundreds of people protested in front of parliament against a proposed energy law in Algiers. The new law is aimed at attracting foreign investors to help Algeria strengthen its energy output, but it would maintain a 49% limit on foreign ownership if passed by the parliament. Demonstrators say the caretaker government had no right to pass the law. In Tunisia, exit polls suggest that independent candidate Kais Saied has been elected the country's next president. Two polls projected that law professor Saied won about 77% of the votes in yesterday's runoff election against Nabil Karoui in central Tunis. As the unofficial result was released, supporters gathered at Said's campaign offices to celebrate. Media mogul Nabil Karoui, who campaigned for elections mostly from prison, secured around 25% of the votes. About 7.2 million voters were registered in over 4,500 polling stations across the country. Spain's Supreme Court has sentenced 9 Catalan separatist leaders to up to 13 years in prison. The court found them guilty of sedition over their role in a failed bid for independence in 2017. The court acquitted all defendants of the rebellion charge. The former head of the Catalonia's regional government, Carles Puigdemont, termed the verdict an atrocity. Catalonia regional leader Quim Torra demanded amnesty for separatist leaders. Acting Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said the Spanish government will abide by the Supreme Court decision. Meanwhile, protesters took to the streets in northeastern Spain against the verdict. Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo and Michael Kramer have won the 2019 Nobel Economics Prize for their work in fighting global poverty. French-American Duflo is the second woman to win the Nobel in economics in the prize's 50 years history. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences said the three economists' work shows how poverty can be tackled. It said over 5 million Indian children have benefited from programs in school as a result of their studies. Banerjee and Duflo are professors at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Mr. Kremer is the Gates Professor of Developing Societies at Harvard University. "37 people have died after Typhoon Hagibis, the most powerful storm to hit Japan in decades, paralyzed Tokyo. Authorities say 166 people have been injured and 20 others are missing. Torrential rains, high-speed winds and overflowing rivers left almost 500,000 homes without power. Over 110,000 rescuers, including 31,000 troops, are searching for people trapped by the disaster. The disaster has left tens of thousands of people in shelters, with many unsure when they will be able to return home. 12 people have died in a gas cylinder explosion in northern Syria. 12 people have died, in the state of Uttar Pradesh in India. Police said the explosion destroyed a two-story building in Mao district. Police said the cylinder blast was likely caused by a gas leak. Several people are still believed to be trapped and a rescue operation is underway. In the United States, amid inflated healthcare costs, millions of Americans seek treatment abroad, contributing to the rapidly growing medical tourism industry. The U.S. healthcare system is a major political issue ahead of the 2020 presidential elections. The details in this report.
Connecting through the San Diego airport, Veronica Merrill has arrived from Phoenix, Arizona for a medical procedure. From here, she'll cross the border into Mexico to have gastric bypass surgery, which isn't covered by her insurance unless doctors diagnose her as medically obese, precisely what Veronica is trying to avoid.
Because it's so much cheaper. And here my insurance wouldn't even cover it. So Tijuana is actually something you can afford. It was like $4,000 to get it done, and here I don't even know. It's probably like $12,000 to $15,000.
And for that price, the medical tourism agency she contacted takes care of everything. She is among the nearly 2 million Americans who travel abroad each year for medical reasons, due to a lack of affordable care in the U.S., where health costs are the highest in the world. Veronica's surgery will take place at a hospital that exclusively treats foreign patients, many from the U.S., where experts say a lack of price regulation is driving medical tourism.
Hi. I'm Dr. Cáceres.
Nice to meet you.
I'm your surgeon.
Sometimes patients worry a little bit about safety. Really, the city is very safe. We have a great experience because we have a large volume of patients. We perform more operations than a doctor in the US.
After a successful surgery and 24 hours of rest, Veronica will be ready to cross the border again and return to Arizona. Back home in the States, healthcare is a central issue in the 2020 elections, and several Democratic candidates have proposed universal coverage, something Veronica considers logical. But even if Medicare for All were introduced, industry officials still see a long life for medical tourism from the U.S.
China's exports declined for a second straight month in September, reflecting the impact of its trade war with the U.S. Custom authorities in Beijing said export shipments fell by over 3%, more than had been forecast by the financial analysts.
Chinese imports fell by 8.5%, far greater than the 6% predicted by analysts. China's foreign trade was strongly affected by the $112 billion in U.S. tariffs enforced from September 15th. Chinese exports to the U.S. fell by nearly 22% in September, while imports from the U.S. dropped by 21%. Despite the fall, Beijing is satisfied with the direction of China's economy.
The proportion of general trade has increased continually, signaling the improvement of the quality of our country's foreign trade development. Meanwhile, China is getting good results from its economic transition.
The weak trade data comes days after the US agreed to delay the imposition of $250 billion of enhanced tariffs on Chinese goods.
Well, stock markets across Europe have dipped in early trade because of the fresh uncertainty about Brexit negotiations. EU bourses have been affected by investors' concerns about poor Chinese trade data for September. The CAC 40 index in Paris has lost about 0.2%. London's FTSE 100 and DAX index in Frankfurt are trading about 0.5% lower. In stark contrast, Asian markets spiked in response to the mini trade deal struck between the US and China on Friday. Defying discouraging Chinese trade statistics, the Shanghai Composite and Nikkei 225 in Tokyo gained more than 1% by the close. The Hang Seng Index also picked up 0.8% as investors pushed aside concerns about another weekend of violent unrest in Hong Kong. Unease among European investors has pushed down international oil prices by about 1%. And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. Thank you for watching. For further updates, stay tuned to Indus News.